Hello there. Good to see you all. Uh, I'm going to be reading a nonfiction piece from a new book of mine called Occasional Views. Uh, and it's a passage from a piece called Beatitudes. It's kind of a survey of my various encounters with all the various uh, Beat Generation writers. Uh, Many of whom were alive when I was a kid, and most of whom at this point are gone. When I was 12 and confined to my room, I wrote angrily in a green leatherette diary with a brass clip lock, "When you grow up, it's important to let your children curse around you." My father, profligate with his goddams and occasional shits and even nigger, he was a black man living in Harlem and from the South, had sent me there because in front of my Aunt Virginia, I'd let slip a damn. The unfairness burned through my whole body. What, in another 5 years, the Beats came to represent for us, yes, I was 17, when, on one weekend, the student demonstrations against desegregation flared at Little Rock, the news of Sputniks orbiting the Earth broke across the world, and in that Saturday's New York Times, Nathan Milstein's highly sympathetic review of Kerouac's On the Road launched it on its career as the novel that would end the 50s and usher into the 60s, were the good, the permissive, the ideally fair fathers who said you could smoke dope, wear your old clothes, let your hair grow long, and cuss as much as you wanted. Huck Finn's pap without the drunken beatings. Given that role, however, how could these free literary men and women who grabbed our awareness by allowing the word to articulate any and every obscenity we kids could even consider, 5 years after Howell was dragged into the courts in 1956, I remember arguing with a dismissive post-30-year-old adult, "But don't you realize that was the first time a poem has been tried for obscenity since the fucking Flowers of Evil?" And the Saturday Review of Literature never even mentioned it? Possibly survived the process, not of their growing up. The Beats and associates who lived did that as well as they could, but of ours. George Preston was a black artist and a decent banjo player who, when he'd been 18 or 19, had been my counselor at Camp Woodland. For several years in my early middle 20s, when I would be standing in line waiting for a teller, in those days before ATM, at the manufacturer's Hanover's Bank on the corner of 8th Street and 6th Avenue, regularly I ran into him, wearing his jeans and blue denim jacket. Invariably, I was coming from my agent's office, then on 10th Street, just off 6th Avenue. We'd exchanged 3 minutes of pleasantries. George was doing okay. I was doing okay. He was having a show. I was having a new book. A year or so too older than I, a year or two older than I, a young man, all but albino, with thick glasses before the palest of coral-colored eyes, another woodland camper, worked at the news kiosk just outside the bank. We all said hello when we passed each other and smiled. Along with Seymour Krim, who I later met through Judy Merrill, artist Al Hansen, who visited me a couple of times on East 7th Street with my friend Anna and had tea, and Richard Seaver, whom I lunched with once when he was briefly interested in a novel of mine during his tenure at Grove Press. George shows up now and again at parties or gatherings photographed and reprinted in collections devoted to the Beats as part of its almost endless cast of what Joyce Johnson as chronicled so brilliantly as minor characters in her 1983 book. What those pictures tell me today is that I was a little too young, a little too bumptious, and hardworking, and just not social enough at the time to have yet wandered into that particular circle. Days before I took off for Europe in 1965, one autumn afternoon I got picked up on Central Park West by painter William McNeill, who, in the first 20 minutes I knew him, dropped what seemed to me, at least at the time, 100 names of beat and peripheral beat writers. Gary Snyder, Joanne Kiger, Helen Adam, Robert Duncan, Jack Spicer, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Michael McClure, Bob Kaufman, which is to say, the friends he was so anxious to let me know he had were writers and poets I had encountered in the Evergreen Review, including that famous 1957 issue 2, the San Francisco scene, in which, 8 years before, I'd first read Howl. 3 days later, on October 18th, I left for a 6-month stay in Europe. 4 days in Luxembourg, 2 weeks in Paris, 2 weeks in Venice. Now they were a couple of weeks to write about. And finally, by ferry, from Brindisi to Athens. After a handful of days in that city, I was 2 months on the islands, first on the Isle of Milos, where the Venus de Milo had been discovered, then on more populous, but still in the winter of 65-66 fairly calm, Mykonos, and finally back in Athens by the 2nd or 3rd week of January. A rough and vivid memory. Sitting on the roof patio of a small stone house in the picturesque neighborhood that, above the Plaka, clung to the back face of the Acropolis like a displaced island village, with my friend Delise, a delicate golden-haired woman from New Orleans. Earthquake refugees from the island of Anafi had first built the little whitewashed stone houses, ran the city's lore, so that the neighborhood was known as Anaphiotica, Little Anafi. While we sat drinking Greek tea, someone down in the street shouted, "Hey, anybody home? Hey!" We looked over the roof's wall edge. Carrying some kind of duffel bag, a scruffy black-haired fellow in his 30s was doing the shouting. "Hey, it's Gregory! We're going to crash here. Joyce said it was okay. Come on, let us in." Beside him stood a rangy blond guy, thumbs beneath wide, drab backpack straps, watching while the others shouted, "Open the fucking door, will you? Let us in." Delise called, "Who are you? What do you want? Come on, it's Gregory. You gonna let us in or not? We're tired. Let us in now." "I'm sorry. I don't know you. I think you must have the wrong place." "This is the place," the black-haired man declared. "Come on, let us in. Let us the fuck in now. I don't have time for this." At which point the blonde one said, "Hey, come on, man. Fuck the bitch. We got these other places to try. Let's get going, will you?" He urged the other by the he tugged the other by the arm. They turned and loped off. Who in the world, Delise turned from the rail, did they think they were? She sat back down. Though I'd only seen his picture on the back of his New Direction volumes, all of which I owned, I'd recognized him immediately. "That was Gregory Corso," I told her. I had no idea who his companion was. "I'm sure the Joyce he was talking about is your friend, Joyce Johnson, the one whose book of poems you showed me?" At one time, Joyce had rented the same house, I gathered, before Delise had taken it over. "Well," declared Delise huffily, "I never met him before." Grape leaves on the trellis whispered, her yolk-pale hair lifted in the afternoon's first breeze. He didn't sound like anyone I'd want staying with me. In the early 60s, Athens itinerant winter internationals were just not that numerous. That same night, I was at a party somewhat near Koloniki where Gregory made an almost equally loud entrance, this time hanging all over the shoulders of an English redhead. Briefly, she'd been the girlfriend of another Englishman I'd been traveling with, John Whitten Doris, with whom he was now staying. Loud, opinionated, and probably stoned, he didn't remain long, and they left to a buzz. "That man," Delise said to me, "is just awful. What is his problem?" "Well," I told her, "he's one of the two most famous poets in the United States right now. And of the two," the other was of course Ginsberg, "I think he's the more talented. That can't be an easy job. Well, I'm glad I didn't let him into my house." Since I was staying on Delisa's living room daybed, I was glad she hadn't too. I had 3 more encounters with Gregory, 2 in Athens, 1 in New York. A few days later, at an iron table in the yard of a Café Neon at the bottom of Nisikleus Street, across from Babastafro's restaurant on the edge of the Agora of Diogenes, conversation between half a dozen people interwove and tangled beneath the leaf and sun scumble that fell through some leaning, thick-trunked tree over the enameled metal table. When Gregory joined us, he knew someone or other I didn't know in the gathering. That day he wasn't particularly loud or unpleasant. He was talking to another man there about a translation he was going to do of Euripides' Bacchantes. Somehow I got into the conversation with some comment about a production I'd heard of but had not actually seen, in which Dionysus had been played by a nude actor. The man to whom Gregory was expostulating was unimpressed. "I can't see why anyone would want to do that." But Gregory, possibly just to be eristic, thought it was a good idea. Others at the table were leaving. Finally, the man said to Gregory, "Well, I'll see you for lunch at my place then, tomorrow." With an explosion of enthusiasm, Gregory turned in his chair to grip high on my arm. "Can we bring this guy along? He sounds pretty interesting." The man smiled at me. "Certainly, if you like," and to me, "That is, if you'd like to come." I blurted, "I'd love to." By now I was 23. He offered to write down his particulars in my notebook, Alan Anson, followed by a Koloniki address. He left, and a moment later, Gregory was up. "Come on!" And I spent the next 2 hours, as I remember, running all over Athens with or just behind Gregory. Where we went or what he was doing, I no longer remember, but it was all very important at the time. In the course of it, we had a lot of beer at various cafes, and there was much agonizing from Gregory about his upcoming Bacchantes translation adaptation. "This is a classic, see? You can't just fuck around with it." I felt wonderfully privileged. By the time, alone, I wandered back through the National Gardens and up through the Plaka to Delisa's in Anaphiotica, I was also pretty drunk. But the next day I made it to Anson's. The apartment was clean, cool, and off-white. Signed Cocteau drawings hung on the walls. I couldn't have been more impressed by Picasso's. Gregory was already there. He was actually cooking lunch for us. It was to be a kind of stew that he'd volunteered to make in the kitchen in a large black Dutch oven. We sat around over glasses of white wine, with Gregory darting to the stove now and then. Anson asked me what I did, and I told him I was writing a novel about Jean Harlow, Christ, Orpheus, and Billy the Kid. Leaning forward on the white table, Gregory said, Jean Harlow? Christ, Orpheus, Billy the Kids, those three I can understand. But what's a young spade writer like you all doing all caught up with the great white bitch? Then he frowned for a moment, sitting back. Of course, I guess it's pretty obvious. Then lunch came to the table. The little red peppers that Gregory had used in the dish turned out to be really hot. After one bite, Gregory put his spoon down and declared, "Oh man, I fucked up. Come on, you guys don't have to eat this shit." Actually, though, it was pretty good. I was hungry, and I've always liked hot food. Anson and I both persevered through a helping each, while Gregory drank cold Retsina. After a concluding snifter of Metaxa, I said thank you and left, and did not see Gregory again for more than a year. It was back in New York on the Lower East Side. It was summer. It was hot. It was muggy. Walking down 9th or 11th or one of those crowded streets over on A, B, or C, I saw a man in a dirty white shirt and ratty black jeans sitting in a doorway with not a lot of teeth. 3 steps later, I realized it was Gregory. I went up and said hello as people wandered by. He was pretty out of it. Did he remember me? Or the over-peppered stew at Anson's? Had he ever seen the quote from our conversation that afternoon that had appeared by now as a chapter epigraph in my paperback novel on page 101 today of the Einstein intersection, published a year or so before by Ace Books? He answered no to all of them. Are you going to be here for a while? I asked tentatively. Man, I'm not going anywhere, he said thickly. I'll bring you a copy of the book, I said. I only live a few blocks from here, and I ran off to get him one. Though I was back in 7 minutes by the clock, of course, he was gone. And I never saw him again. In Brenda Knight's Women of the Beat Generation, the first entry is Helen Adams, 1909 to 1993. I met Helen within a week of my return from Europe in April 1966. Although I wasn't to learn of it till years after I first met her, Helen had been a child prodigy in Scotland, where her first book of ballads, The Pagan Elf, was published. She'd been 12, and it had been made much of on both sides of the Atlantic. Her name speckles literary accounts of the 1920s, much like in other times the names Hilda Conklin, Minna Drouet, Daisy Ashford, or Natalia Crane. Such infantile precocity is a terrible weight for a serious artist to bear as an adult. That is probably a good deal of the reason that Helen, with her sister Pat and their mother, moved to the United States after World War II, settling in San Francisco. Here is the critic William Rose Benet writing in 1924. Some time ago in Scotland, there was a little girl named Marjorie Fleming, and today a 12-year-old, Helen Douglas Adam, the daughter of a Scottish parson and his wife of Dundee, is her successor to the juvenile purple. Miss Adam has now been published both in England and America. Helen Douglas Adam lived a life committed to poetry, and to a concept of poetry that was from time to time, in the words of Carolyn Kaiser describing the poet Judith Johnson, splendidly unfashionable. Her work was anthologized in the groundbreaking New American Poetry, 1960 anthology put together by Donald Allen, Her influence on poets like the late Robert Duncan was mutual and profound. Certainly one of Duncan's most popular poems, The Ballad of Mrs. Noah, began as a conscious and conscientious effort to write something in the same genre that Helen had made so exciting to poets who would eventually be labeled the San Francisco Renaissance. With her magical readings at the various galleries in San Francisco during the 1950s. Helen was a poet to whom music and magic were the most important things about language. Brocade was her fabric, purple was her color, the ballad was her form. To talk about Helen, I have to repeat some of what I've already told. The first time I recall hearing Helen Adams' name was 2 nights before I left Europe on October 18, 1965. I've already told you how I met Bill McNeill by Central Park that night, and the poets he mentioned, and as I said, one of them was Helen Adams. 5 years before, as I mentioned, Adam had worked in Donald Allen's important anthology, but I could not hear of that. But I would not hear of that book for more than another year. Adam had had no work yet in the Evergreen Review, nor had she published a volume with the Pocket Poet series, and the fact that she lived on the West Coast meant hers was a name I didn't know. A relatively detailed account of that night's meeting and the day it climaxed form section 59.8 toward the end of my autobiography, The Motion of Light in Water. I remembered it as strictly and as carefully as I could in 1987 when I wrote it. The only thing I can think of is that I possibly left out as Bill and I sat together under the streetlight by the park bench at 10 o'clock outside of its stone wall was perhaps a mention by Bill that he and Helen had collaborated on a film together, Daydream of Darkness. If you, the reader, are interested in timing and details, read my account in Motion. For better or for worse, timing and details are what constitute reality. 6 months later, on the evening of April 15, 1966, I returned to the States in the Lower East Side, and when I walked in, Marilyn Hacker, my wife, was sweeping the floor, and Bill was getting ready to leave for his new apartment off Hudson Street. Things had changed, mostly for the good, I thought, but other things had remained unsettlingly the same. Marilyn had prepared me for Helen's criticism of Babel 17 on the first night I met her. Helen had read it when it had come out a month or so after Empire Star, while I'd been away in Greece. At a side table in the back room of the Old Reliable, on my first visit to what would be the first regular bar I ever felt proprietary about, Helen sat with Russell and Dora Fitzgerald and Lou Ellingham and Bill, who'd come again, at the west side of the back room. Marilyn said you'd read my book and that you had some thoughts. I'd really like to know what they are. Well, she answered, let me be honest. She was a gaunt, lively, older woman with iron gray hair and a voice, resonant, Scottish tinged, which, in another context, I once described for a fictional character based on Helen as hair of tarnished silver, voice of scrap brass. She went on. I thought it was a magical book, full of poets and monsters and ghosts and dragons, all in the oddest places that were quite exciting. Then, in the last few pages, something happens and it becomes a rather silly book about an intergalactic war nobody could possibly believe in or care about. She sighed, smiled, and shook her head. There, that's it. I enjoyed it up until the end, though. The main reason I remembered it is because I agreed. I remember Helen at parties, a housewarming at Marilyn's on Henry Street, after which, a few days later, Marilyn and I decided we'd separate, a brunch at Bill McNeill's loft, where I met Barbara Wise, and she asked me if I wanted to do a film, an evening gathering at Barbara and Howard Wise's on 13th Street, and I remember her at dinners at her tiny apartment with her sister Pat and the numberless statues of Anubis in the East 80s. And I remember once, shortly after I met her in 1966, when she and some friends had come to my 7th Street apartment after brunch at Speedy's and the Old Reliable, and we had been talking to her about James Thompson's City of Dreadful Night, which I'd only read an anthologized fragment from. 2 days later, in the mail arrived the whole 28-page poem that Helen probably had had Pat Xerox for me and bound in a plastic cover. It was octavo size, of the sort used at the time to protect library book jackets, in which she had put some gold foil and some beautiful leaves to make an extraordinary booklet of the poem. I remember going night after night to her musical play, San Francisco's Burning, at the Judson Poets Theater, standing through it, squeezed in the side aisle, because there was only a standing room left, and applauding till my hands were sore at its wonder and its life and its mighty and joyous mystery. A production of San Francisco Burning had already been mounted on the West Coast before Helen and Pat left California for New York. Among those still alive, Dora Fitzgerald, Joanne Kiger, Louis Ellingham, William Alvin Moore, and George Stanley were in attendance. In New York, though Pat was somewhat reclusive, Helen was outgoing and social. I remember Helen at a party of Marilyn's on Henry Street, and I'm all but certain it was Russell's day-long. I'm all but certain she was at Russell's day-long 1967 birthday party at his and Dora's apartment on the 4th floor of 68 East 3rd Street. Possibly her biographer, Kristen Pravlett, has the date of her arrival in the city. I'm going to cut this off here because I think that's probably what the timing suggests, but I will just read one part that I remember her reciting from the play, San Francisco's Burning. I am the fair forgetfulness, whom men seek only in pain, who sleeps in the bed of the worm queen, will never sleep again. One of the most delightful nights in the theater I think I've ever had. Okay, thank you very much.